As you know, we're studying the 9th chapter, Bhagavad Gita, and I will leave a space for questions related to this afterwards. So just to recap, because we haven't met for now a few weeks, and last week we had a beautiful guest who talked very nicely on a slightly different subject, although something which is similar, that is the practicality of spiritual life. And when we study the Srimad Bhagavad Gita, we are studying a practical book. In fact, any scripture which is not really practical, we wonder, can it really be scripture? That is, a divinely inspired series or guidelines, a kind of manual, a kind of handbook that you can open in order to create a resolution to your various difficulties and problems, and give you a practical guideline to proceed in life in a positive way that culminates ultimately in a realization. And the realization is seen to be the fulfillment of our purpose. What is our central purpose? Our central purpose is essentially to have knowledge, but it's not knowledge of an academic kind. It is the full absolute knowledge of pure being. That's the knowledge we are seeking. And how will we benefit from that practically? In the beginning, we'll want to know. But as we progress, we'll abandon this whole idea of any benefit to us. It would just be superfluous, just as when you observe a beautiful sunset, you're not looking for a particular benefit or making any kind of correction. We don't look at it and say, well, I think God made some errors here, it should be a little bit more purple here, or he should have put a little bit more blue in there. We simply absorb the scene and become part of it, become one with it, and stand in a glorious wonder, a sense of wonderment as we observe this entity of beauty. And it may then inspire us to understand what is that lights that scene. What is that? He's shining, that's shining, all things shine, he's shining, all things shine. Tameva bantum, etc. He's shining, all things shine. And then we can have a meditative process that says, not only in the sunrise, sunset, or other beautiful scenes, but in the eyes of a human. It's easy to see this in the eyes of a child. And some may be skeptical about human nature and say, never mind about a child, I see it in a dog, or I see it in a cat, and so on. But to see it in a human, of course, is to also get the clue of some internal intelligence, some kind of spark that has the capacity to investigate their environment, what we call science, and to see and appreciate the beauty there and get an internal rapture about it that ultimately leads to a kind of perpetual rapture, a sense of joy. So the Bhagavad Gita has this chapter, Raja Vidya, Raja Guhya, that is, it's a royal secret and a royal knowledge, royal secret. And we've covered that previously. And the last time we covered a stanza which showed that even though things move and change, even though there's a perpetual motion, as it were, that we can perceive, there is an indication of something static that drives it. Philosophically, that's sound. Because if that thing is moving as other things move, we require a static mover, something that remains, but by its presence, by its proximity, everything else moves. And so the stanza is like this, just to remind you of it. Maya jakshina prakriti suyate sacharacharam hetana nena konteya jagat vipari vartati. Because of my closeness, my proximity, I am some kind of supervisor. And here Krishna is standing as the supreme principle, the supreme creative faculty. And when we view this entity, it really reflects on how we view the world itself. If we think of this world as a kind of creation, then that supreme becomes a creator for us. But if we view this as some kind of protected field, then that supreme becomes a protector, supreme protector for us. Or if we think that this universe is something like a play of waves, with different frequencies, different amplitudes, then the Lord becomes the supreme player. All of these hold a kind of beauty for us and act as a way of understanding and appreciating this curious thing that an entity stands, and by its proximity everything else responds and moves. The nearest kind of concept we can have is a supervisor. I'll always remember one devotee who had a garage, and he decided that he would come back a little early from leave and see how things were going. And so as he went through the door, he heard whistles and whisperings, because the entire workforce was having perpetual tea. And so they immediately got up and started working, or appeared to be working. You know. So it's well known that if you want to look busy, then make sure that you have a clipboard and walk in a strident manner from place to place. So unless there is a supervisor, very often things don't work well. So it requires that kind of impersonal entity that itself doesn't move, but by its very proximity, it's moving. And so that's where we left off. So the term adhyaksha is very important, a presiding principle that precedes everything and seems to keep an alert eye on things. This is the principle is what we call Ishvara. That is what is translated in English as God. And the English word God, of course, comes from the Germanic hut, G-U-D, which in turn comes from Sanskrit hutam, that thing worth offering something to. So we can get the idea of it. Now, of course, what happens then if somebody doesn't appreciate all these subtleties and doesn't appreciate that there's a huge wave that comes from time to time, you remember? So yada yada hi dharmasya, from age to age, this cosmic balancing power appears and leaves its effect for thousands of years to come. And we can register this. In Hinduism we find Ram, and then we find Krishna. Even before that we find various other incarnations that some may say represent the evolutionary history of life. And we have then, in terms of human messengers, we find included in this all these that you find here on this shrine. That's why we call it an interfaith shrine. So we find representation of Buddha. We find that Jesus, we can accept Jesus as a supreme messenger like that, who came and left his effect for several thousands of years. We won't worry about the historicity of it. We'll leave that to those who want to entertain intellectual gymnastics. For our purposes, some great entity came and left its mark. Of course, there will be some theological differences, because, and the 13th president of the Ramakrishna Math Mission once joked with me. He said, "You see, I feel very sorry for your Christians." Why is that, Maharaj? You see, because Christians, the Christian God can only have one son. Ours can have as many sons as he likes. And so I took that in good humor, but that's a significant difference, you see, that if there is this cosmic balancing power, this cosmic mind that we call Logos, it can leave its impact. Supposing we don't accept that theological position, are we then doomed a little bit? No. We can surely take the understanding, even as the Buddhists do, that somebody is incarnated or evolved to such an extent that finally appears and leaves the mark. Because in Vedanta, everything is one. You can imagine it like one ocean, and we are merely small waves, and every kind of species or every kind of perceived vision will be something like an eddy or a current or a wave. But a giant wave comes along and leaves its mark for thousands of years. How can we not see the divine hand in it, or the infinite ocean that stands behind it? And what if we don't? Have we lost an opportunity? It seems foolish then that a remarkable teacher who was revolutionary and reconciling all different positions marked here in the Srimad Bhagavad Gita. It seems that people would have lost out. An example of one of those who lost out was Duryodhana. Because don't forget, this is an extract from the Mahabharata, and you have to understand this background. That Duryodhana and Arjuna both sought Krishna's help. And Krishna happened to be lying on the couch sleeping, and when he woke up, his eyes alighted on the person he first saw. And so he gave a choice. Yeah, of course I'll help you. You've come here to seek my help. I'll give you help, impartially. And so he offered all his armies, all his forces, and so on and so forth. Duryodhana, naturally seeing Krishna as just another king with a vast array of forces at his disposal, not seeing any higher dimension, immediately accepted all the military might. But Arjuna, having this great insight, was relieved and said, I will take you. You are enough. Of course, logically, if you can spin all the galaxies, if you have the supreme power, if you and the Father are indeed one, then to have you on my side will be, practically speaking, a victory. But that's not what was behind it. What was in his mind was a devotion to this supreme entity, a love which is there, a recognition of this inherent divinity that appeared uniquely as this messenger, as this teacher, as this reformer, as this guru, who is the last resort in the midst of all this difficulty, all this psychological trauma, all this emotional upheaval, resorting finally in desperation with tears in his eyes. There's no one else I can take refuge in. Are we not all in the same boat? Should we also not say that everything in life that can be used as a formula out of my unhappiness, or can be used as a way out of pain, everything that we resort to, we've just done the Enneagram here on the weekend, we pointed this factor out, that what are we trying to do? We're trying to change a habit where previously we thought our final formula to happiness has to shift and change. Previously it was within the senses, and that includes the mind. And the desires can be very, very subtle. We think of desires as desires for objects. We don't think about the subtlety of it. That behind the desire for an object is a psychological yearning to be recognized, to be liked. All of these are profound, subtle desires behind the material desire for sensual compensation, as it were. And he gave the example during that course of how childish the desires can be. Supposing you say to a child, what do you think heaven is like? And the child responds, probably 1 ton of ice cream will do. You say, my dear child, I arranged it. 1 ton of ice cream delivered to your door. After a few spoonfuls, I said, thank you, I've had enough heaven. But then you see the following day, they'll want a little bit more. This is the same. But can you see the childish aspect of it? So when we talk about fools, we're really talking about an aspect within us which is childish. It's very different from childlike. Childlike is a quality we have to cultivate. But childishness means a lapse in our memory of what is true and what is real. It means a putting aside of the discernment and the discernment capability that we have. This creates our foolishness. Somebody who is involved in foolishness is somebody who is taking this world as more than it is, rather than an ephemeral thing, taking it for something that is eternal, taking the finite to be the infinite, taking the impermanent to be the permanent. This is a lack of discernment or a lack of viveka. And so, this maya, this appearance, as it were, with 3 evolutionary forces in full play, that blinds us to this reality, as it were, and makes us respond in a way that encourages us to perpetuate our species on the one hand, and to take refuge in the sensual world on the other is called avidya maya. Avidya maya. So the maya has these two dimensions, vidya maya, avidya maya. I was talking to some Advaitins once, and they used this phrase. They says, we need to conquer Maya. We need to get over Maya. We need to destroy Maya. And then I said, well, Maya comes in two versions, avidya and vidya. Surely you don't want to get rid of vidya Maya. So what is vidya Maya? Its content is sattva, this sattvic element. It is still Maya, of course. It is still a knot that binds us, or a rope that binds us. But by using it, in Ramakrishna's language, by taking one thorn and removing another thorn from your foot. He gives another funny example, of course, of this. And you can imagine it in a modern traveling context, two people in a train. And I use this example quite often. So they strike up a conversation. One man notices the other man has a box with holes in. And he says, he's inquisitive and says, please can you tell me, out of just inquisitiveness, curiosity, what's in the box? Well, he says, it's a mongoose. He says, oh, why do you carry a mongoose with you? Well, it's to catch the snakes. And immediately he puts his feet up on the bench. What snakes? I says, don't worry, they're imaginary snakes. Imaginary snakes. And then he lifts the lid of the box. He says, of course it's an imaginary mongoose. I carry an imaginary mongoose to catch the imaginary snake. And so this is a technique we have to use in order to conquer, as it were. This Maya is a bad language. It's to transcend it. Use it to transcend it. And then understand even Maya is that oneness. It's just an expression. When you add that, the absolute, when you add the time and space and the relative aspect of things, what will you find? You'll find a oneness everywhere. So this stanza goes like this. The ways of the ignorant are being described. Avajananti mam mutta manusyam tanam ashritam param bhavapam ajananto mama bhuta maheshwaram. That is, people disregard avajananti. Which people? These are the fools. The fools disregard me. Now there are many examples of that happening, of prophets, messengers, incarnations being disregarded. Not only disregarded, but taken for something that they are not. The Lord Jesus was taken for a criminal and hung on a cross. Imagine now how Christians worship Jesus. In those days they didn't understand it. Only a handful of people understood this divinity which was there, that we call the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One. And so Duryodhana had the same difficulty. He didn't see that divinity. He didn't have the purity of mind and the understanding and the knowledge to see, oh Lord, you are there, dressed up in this way. Fools disregard me, how? As one clad, that is dressed up in human form. This applies to everybody everywhere. And I often think of Leo Tolstoy's famous story, and around a man who was a simple cobbler. He, from his very youth, had made shoes, sewn them together, and he lived in a basement. Now his wife had died previously, and he became a very old man, and he was left with a child, and the child also died, and he was left in a state of depression. And his only view of the world was from his basement, a small window, where he saw the feet of people, and most of the feet he recognized because he'd fixed most of the shoes, or sewn the shoes together and sold them. And so he recognized, oh, that's so-and-so, just by their feet. And he was in conversation, because he was very depressed, with somebody who said, no, you should read this book. What was this book? Scripture. If you read this and take refuge in that and see all the lessons of it, not just a series of legalistic do's and don'ts, but there's something profound in there, some formula that you can use for practical life. And he began to read this. In those days, of course, we're talking of Tolstoy's era even. Very few people could read, but he managed to do this and used the scripture and became so engrossed in it and attached to it, loved it very much. But it started him thinking, and sure enough, he found some joy in it. And as he was thinking, he drifted off one night into a kind of semi-sleep, and he wasn't sure if it was an actual voice or if it was just dreaming that said, I will visit you tomorrow. I will come physically and visit you. So he was very excited about this, and he took it to be a real thing. And so, having the advantage of seeing all the feet outside the window, he looked very carefully that day. Will the Lord visit me? Because I won't recognize the feet. And I surely recognize the Lord. The Lord's feet must be something like luminous, shining, something like that. As he was looking out of the windows expectantly, he happened to see a number of things. One thing he saw was an old man who he recognized, an old soldier who was homeless, and a neighbor had given him a home, and he was busy shoveling snow, and he was very cold. And it occurred to him, let me bring this person inside and give him a nice cup of tea. And so he brought him inside, gave him a nice cup of tea, warmed him up nicely, nourished him. And the man was very grateful for it and said, thank you so much, and went out and with renewed vigor continued his work. Second thing he saw was the feet of, obviously, a woman, a young woman with a child. The child was shivering, and the woman was taking shelter by the window, and he felt very sorry for this. He brought the two in and heard their story of distress, how this woman had, her husband had died in the war, how she had no manner of income, and how to support the child, and so on. So he gave them food, and then he managed to, and the lady had sold her last piece of clothing for some money, and he managed to find an old coat and give it to her, and then various other things, so that she went at least fed, and she went clothed. And then there was another case where there was a ruckus outside, and there was a boy who was caught by a woman selling apples. And the boy had obviously stolen an apple. And he went outside immediately and said, have some compassion on this boy, you know, he'll learn a lesson. He took him by the ear a little bit. This was not in the 20th, 21st century. This was all permitted in these days. And gave the boy a stern telling off. Now you promise, don't do this again. And he said, I'll pay for the apple, don't worry. And then made the boy and the woman who was selling the apples happened to make friends with each other, and they understood each other, and they went off, and she forgot to ask for the money for the apples, and he went back inside, drifting off to sleep again after a long hard day, with no sight of the Lord anywhere. He happened to pick up his favorite book, and there he saw this passage, you know. When did you clothe me? When did you feed me? He who does these to the least of my children does it unto me. That passage he read. And he realized, in this form you were. You were here in the form of the child and the apple seller. You were here in the form of the woman and the child that sought refuge. You were here in the form of the old man that required some warm food and some comforting words. And so, this is Vidyamaya. This is what we should be seeing. Those who have eyes and ears, let them see and let them hear. So, we all are fools in this way. If we do not see that this is the Lord of the universe, clad in this human form, but how much more obviously in a great saint, in a great holy person, and how much more in a divine incarnation that comes for a specific purpose, unblemished, there to guide humanity for thousands of years, until another requirement is made for this cosmic mind to exert its balancing power. So fools disregard me as one clad in human form, not knowing my higher nature, this highest nature of all of Ishvara, as what? As the great Lord of beings. Now in hindsight we can do that. So in the era, in the proximity, historical proximity of these great incarnations, should we not take advantage of this? Is it not in our favor to understand this? And so, should we not, if we are dedicated, say, to Jesus or Buddha, let's say Jesus, should we not from time to time get to know that entity? Should we not at least know how does that person walk? Even when somebody of steady wisdom, this question is asked earlier. Somebody of steady wisdom, Sthita Prajna, how do they walk? How do they talk? What is their mannerisms? How do they behave? Can we emulate that? Is it an error that we have this wonderful book that Swami Vivekananda was so dedicated to called Imitation of Christ? Should we not get this same imitation? Should we not imagine, or could we not imagine, walking by the Sea of Galilee with Jesus and sitting down with him, having caught some fish, cooking it? Don't worry about, with vegetarianism and all of this, forget that. Just the divine company sitting there, drinking in his divine words. From time to time, fetching water from the sea, from the Lake Galilee, so that he can drink something. And then monitoring the crowds, and then walking with him, sleeping on the ground where he sleeps, waking up in the morning, trying to keep up with the early morning meditation that he may have, going up the mountain, enjoying and relishing his divine company. Should we not imagine what is his style of walking? How fast does he walk? Hanging on his every word, serving this Master as best we can, thinking of his glory, and then participating in that transfiguration. We don't often talk about Ramakrishna in these terms, but those who study the life of Sri Ramakrishna will be struck by the event of the 1st of January, this Kalpataru day, where the Lord transforms himself and affects all of those by a mere touch, by a glance, by a word, by a presence. Such are the glorious emanations and shining illuminations of these great entities. But obvious to everybody? No. Sri Ramakrishna was in the garden in Dakshinaswar. A person came to visit specifically to see him. He thought he was the gardener. And he said, in an offhand way, "Oh, pick a flower for me." And so obligingly he picks a flower, gives it. Then as he went and entered into the place where Sri Ramakrishna spoke to people, his room in the corner there at Dakshinaswar, he was struck. Oh, it's the same person. It's the gardener. No, it's not the gardener. Sri Ramakrishna enlightening others. And then he queried it. But you asked me for a flower, I gave you a flower. It's all right. Didn't recognize anything special. And this is also the capacity to hide or reveal is there. If we have a mind to, if we tune into this glorious grace of this great Lord of beings, we will get this corresponding movement of revelation that happens toward us. So the Lord, who is not bound by any karma, we are bound by karma. This is the distinction. Not bound by any human form, and yet clad, you see the language, clad, dressed in this form. Just like space, or ether if you will, or a primordial element, is not limited by any form, and while containing all of the other forms that come from it, if you know about all these tattvas and elements, expands undivided into infinity, that kind of understanding. So the same is the case with this Chit Aghasha, this space as it were of consciousness. It's eternally pure, wakeful and free. And And it is through this Paramatma, the supreme entity, the supreme self, is the common background to the entire creation. He assumes occasionally, of course, is the idea, a perfect form. See, a perfect form. Something that is unusual, even though it's a human form. Something that if we look carefully will be something special, even though it's human. The eyes will glow with a certain glow. The skin will be luminous. If we have an eye to see it, we'll catch it. And if there's a will on the other side to reveal it. So, though this Paramatman is the common background to the entire creation, he assumes occasionally a perfect form, a perfect human form, and seems to be enshrined in it. Why human? Because we're human. He has to relate on the human level, solely with the object of teaching humanity that it is possible for them also not to be bound by the body while living in it, residing in it. Though not knowing this divine play that is going on in every form, but in this particular case, as the special form, they treat this special incarnation, avatar means that entity that descends to us, also as an earthbound one. And because we don't see any difference, because we're fools and don't know any better, slight that person, not only slight that person, but hang him on a cross. Imagine. So Sri Ramakrishna has this comment to make. The elephant has the visible tusks and the invisible set of teeth, both. Similarly, the incarnation like Sri Krishna have the human and the divine combined in them. While appearing as the human, they are the transcendental divine, unaffected by karma or action or cause or effect or sowing or reaping and any other thing which is mundane. It took some 300 years and more for the early Christian community to sort out the nature of Christ. Some saying he was only divine. Some saying he was only human, some saying he was human and divine, some saying he was illusory, some saying he was transcendent, until eventually they came to this consensus and conclusion, we might say divinely inspired conclusion that this same passage gives us, that there's a humanity and a divinity both combined. And what a beautiful way to put it, that is clad in this human form, for our sake, for our benefit. Not for any salvation, but because there's an expression of fullness already there, awaiting, in order to carry us along with the momentum of this giant wave. And so it goes on like this. Mogasa, moga karmano, moga jnana vichetasaha, rakshasim asurim chaiva prakritim mohinim shritaha. This mogashaha of vain hopes, moga karmana of vain actions, and moga jnanaha of vain knowledge, devoid of discrimination, partaking truly of the delusive nature. And here is mentioned two kinds of entities, Rakshasas and Asuras. So this requires some explanation. You see, we all have these three aspects to the mind where we have some hope for the future. And then there's a willing part where we act. And then there's an intellectual part where we want to have some kind of knowledge. And if we restrict it to the immediate environment in which we live, that is, a single entity, a body-mind complex that is in a relationship with people, places, and events, and we try to get some meaning from it, and we're simply bound by action, reaction, nothing more, then we're not going anywhere. And is this not vain? And this word, of course, English word vain, has two intrinsic meanings. One means empty. It has no purpose. It's not going anywhere. And the other one, of course, is associated with vanity itself. So it's vanity as well, because it's hinged around this egocentric position, I, self-interest. Why do I have hope? It's for myself. Why do I do any action at all? It's because I want to be a go-getter. And why do I have a knowledge? Because I want to assert it, my superiority, my intellectual superiority. This could be in egoistic positions in three varieties. But it's also vain in the sense that it's empty. It goes nowhere. It's like a car. We decide we'll reverse it, for 5 seconds out of the garage and push it forward 5 seconds in and claim we've gone on a journey. No, we've gone nowhere. +1, -1, that's all. And as soon as we want something and hope for something, there's a bracketed thing behind it which says, I haven't got it. Anything that wants to be done in the sense of fulfillment means we are not fulfilled. If you have, a goal, my pursuit is happiness, intrinsically you're saying, I'm not happy. This is what I want. If you say, I want wealth, it means I haven't got it, or in sufficient quantities that will fulfill me. If you say, even in a prayer, Lord, make me healthy. Well, if the Lord is on the other end of the email, he might reply, are you not healthy? No, in the future. Well, change your thinking now, change your diet, etc., and then we'll see. So we tend to think of this in this way. Even in prayer life, we tend to think of things in a very primitive way in the beginning. Nothing wrong with it in the beginning. But as we develop more, we must realize, surely, it's not a good formula. It's not working for us. +1, -1, nothing happens. At some stage, there should be a realization. There's an intrinsic fullness and perfection everywhere that has to be expressed, tuned into, and expressed. And that removes all the anxiety and struggle and effort in spiritual life. Is replaced by a sense of joy. And the subsequent passages will endorse that. So what makes this, all these actions and hopes and efforts at knowledge, what makes them all full of or have no purpose? Is because they are devoid of discrimination. Taking one thing to be permanent when it's impermanent. Taking one thing to be meaningful when it just disappears. Putting things out of context. Closing things in, confining things to an immediate isolation, which is me and my immediate environment. And that closing in also creates for us a meanness, a narrowness. You take a flower when it closes up, it becomes less generous. When it's fully open, it seems to say, please, my fragrance is available to everybody. And all manner of insects may settle on me and gather my pollen, my nectar. And my color is for every eye to see. That generosity of spirit will be there. But what's the key? It was an opening process. It opened. And more than that in this analogy, it can also face the sun. We have a basil plant on our windowsill. It started off as a poor orphan. And now it's blooming. And where is it directed to? It's directed to the sun. And it's even flowering. And it's clinging to the window as such. And we water it and look after it nicely. And Prince Charles would be very proud of us. We talk to it. Everything. We follow all these rules. And we look after it as our own child. See? And it's responding. So there's something intrinsic within it and within everything that responds in this way. Please don't tell me this is insentient. It is not. The famous Jagadish Chandra Bose that was supported so much by Sister Nivedita, he made a science of this. How we find, how the plants are sentient, how they respond to vibration, how they respond to their environment. And we can add to this the modern science of epigenetics, which tells us in a scientific way how this works, much more so. So, partaking truly of the delusive nature of what we mean by this Rakshasa and Ashara. Ashara, of course, is the opposite of Shura. Surya, sun, something that shines. And in the early days of the Vedas, we found that Asharas were these supernatural entities, or these supreme entities that could explain those things that were not shining, and therefore they were deemed to be much more than what they were taken to be eventually. And the Iranian people, that is the Persian people, they took that. And because As was difficult to pronounce, they had to be Ahura, their supreme was Ahura Mazda. So, what are the asuras? The things that do not shine within us, within our psyche. The elements of ignorance, and we can soon identify within us what they would be. The denial of the truth, the lack of discrimination, the thing that puts us more and more in a component way into darkness and ignorance. And along with that, of course, comes egoism. And the characteristics of the Rakshasas is selfishness, self-centeredness. Here the ego component comes in. So, Mohini Prakriti is the delusive nature, and it makes men, people, humans, believe that bodily existence is the be-all and end-all of life. But I can assure you that if you take this life as the sole thing that we have, and it is so important, then you will soon realize as you advance in life, in years, in physical years, and hopefully also psychological years, that, because as you advance, you see Shakespeare's, thing, that the sans teeth and so on and so forth, all of that goes along with it, you see. We now revert, you see, back to the baby stage. The full cycle goes on. The teeth go, form a reception committee, hopefully on the other side. The hair goes, the hearing goes, the ears go, sense of smell go, all of these start going, you see. And hopefully we don't wind up with the language of the baby, which, as you know, is Google. So sooner or later we realize that it's quite evident that left and right in our circle of friends and acquaintances, people start disappearing. It's not a magic thing. The body just fails. And so all of us, without exception, will not be here in this same form to discuss and think of these issues within at least probably the next, I don't know, let's be conservative, certainly the next 70 years. Of course, with artificial limbs and so on and so forth, all kinds of things could happen, but there will be a deterioration of this body. And it is meant to be like that, because this is a finite existence. This organic machine that we have is designed for a certain lifespan. Just as a car is only good for a certain lifespan. We only have a certain shelf life. We may as well maximize it. So the transitoriness of the mundane existence does not occur to such people. And sense indulgence is the one thing that appeals to them. Their hopes, activities, and understandings are all directed to this one end, and it's impossible for them to discern between the real and the unreal. That is, the permanent and the impermanent. And among the people of this base makeup, the Rakshasas, even in mythology, are they in whom Rajasic nature predominates. And those of Asuras are those in which Tamasic nature predominates. Asura, the extinguishing of a life, the anti-light which is there. So this is our tamasic. Tamas means darkness. And along with it, all the qualities of inertia and so on. And those of Rajasic nature. So how do we transform all this? We have to have a technique where we promote sattva. And every spiritual teacher says the same thing. All you have to do is a cleaning exercise. Clean the mind. Fill it with God's glory or divine glory. Fill it with the ultimate positivity, with no doubt, with absolute faith, with absolute purity of mind. And purity means clarity. You will say, oh, I don't know about this, I'm agnostic. Well, fill the mind with knowledge, and with Gnosticism, and the agnosticism will go. And how do we do that? So on this Enneagram, somebody perpetually asked, because didn't quite grasp it. Because there's an additional, and how. Like a child, you see, would say, why? At some point you have to cut it off and say, why not, what next? Keep quiet. And then the next question for the child is, why? So it goes on, there's no end to it. See? So at some point, you see, we have to cut that off, and the Rajasic element is there, that predominates. Sattva is the way. To be done systematically, scientifically also. In the framework of time that is available to us, using a blank check called a second, I say this frequently, you put something good in, some higher value, that has no egocentric position in it. Something that has a generosity of spirit, something which has a breath, something like a flower, able to share its beauty with others, its fragrance with others. And so Jesus says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. There's a wonderful telling statement in this summary of teachings that we find in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Is it possible to see? Yes, not with the physical eyes, of course. But is it possible to have a revelation within by itself, effortlessly, easily done, just by a cleaning process? Clean the mind. Clean the mind with the Lord's name. Clean the mind with holy company. Clean the mind with a new attitude that sees the highest in everything, that sees the self in all beings in the self, that kind of thing. That sees God in everything and everyone, in all people, in all places, in all events, in all circumstances. And so in contrast to that, we have to ask this question, what is the way of the devoted? And so it continues on this positive thing, and here's where this lesson becomes practical now. We know what to avoid, what not to do, but here's what to do now. Mahatmanas tu mam partha, daivim prakritim ashritaha, bhajantyananya manaso, jnanatva bhutadim avyayam. Great souls, Mahatmanas. See? Atman, self, Maha, great. Great souls. How do we know which soul is great? Great soul ones are those who are obviously not selfish. Why is it, and I mentioned so many times, that we feel a spontaneous admiration and affinity even for those not obviously spiritual? Such people such as Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela cultivating properties, obvious properties such as patience, kindness and wisdom. His quotations are all over the place. And yet he never mentioned what his religious or spiritual affiliation was. But it's obvious that something happened. A maturity happened, this childishness went, and he decided that he would have such a generosity of spirit that in the most difficult circumstances, he is accepted by all the warring factors, or factions I should say, in a country. And immediately there's a spontaneous admiration for any saint, a spontaneous admiration for Sister Nivedita, a dedicated one who lays her whole life down for a cause and manages to achieve in her small lifetime of mere 44 years what the average person dilly-dallies over. So what is a Mahatman? Mahatman is somebody who gathers all these energies and from a point of view of purity of intention, a generosity of spirit, a love for humanity beyond the pale of their own small environment. And that becomes obvious to everybody. A spontaneous inward admiration occurs in the rest of the people, inspiring others to do the same. One person has done it, we can all do it. It's not that there was a special Nivedita energy or a special Nelson Mandela energy. There's a Beethoven within all of us. There's a Nelson Mandela within all of us. There's a potential to be dedicated. And that is simply taking a strong urge, a strong desire, having some magnificent obsession for the goodness of others, and going with it without looking left or right, without any deviation, with a complete concentration, a complete unity of purpose, a unified drive that creates, that yields a result because of the energy, the focused energy of it. So these are the great Mahatmas. And we are all potentially that. So but the Mahatmans of partaking of the divine nature, in other words, spontaneously drinking it, worship me with a single mind, knowing me as the immutable, the unchangeable and source of all beings. Ramakrishna once asked Narendra, who became Swami Vivekananda, supposing there was a resource of honey, would you want to dive into it or just sip from the corner? He said, I prefer to sip from the corner. But why not dive in? Oh, it's sticky. Now we know all about honey and stickiness in this place, because honey travels well to every corner of the table if you're not careful. And we can view it as a sticky substance. But Sri Ramakrishna points out it's a honey of a different kind. Because when you immerse yourself into such sweetness and bliss, it is not that you want to, that you see the fear is, my individuality goes. And I'll be sticky and I'll never be able to get out of that kind of thing. See? But the analogy is correct. Honey is beautiful, sweet thing supplied by nature. And diving into this blissful nectar, why shouldn't we do it? And lose ourselves completely. That's the idea. So this becomes a kind of spiritual evolution of its own kind. Starting off by sitting on the edge. We'll start off probably by looking at it, listening to somebody who tasted a little bit, and then venturing to the edge, and then dipping a tongue in a little bit, and then seeing, oh, it is sweet, see? And then finally, well, why don't I just enter into it? Like, who's the bear who likes honey? What's the...
Yogi Bear.
Pooh Bear. Pooh Bear.
Is that... You'll have to ask children that. He loves honey. Has a hat, Paddington. All right. So it's not just tasting; it's partaking. See the language. Partaking of the divine nature. What happens? In the beginning, we worship from a sense of separation. I'm here, Lord is there, I'll offer flowers. But here is spontaneous feeling of perpetual worship, not just half an hour, not just now and then, not just when I feel like it, but a spontaneous, perpetual attitude of worship comes about with a single mind, you see, and knowing me, not just thinking about me as it, but actually knowing this nature, not just as a principle, but actually knowing me. That is this divine entity as the immutable, the thing that never changes, and also the source of all beings. So Devi Prakriti is the divine nature which runs counter to the delusive nature that was mentioned previously in the previous stanza. And this is born of this Sattva Guna. So if you don't understand what this is, you've explained it a few times, but we should continue to explain it. Nature comes with three evolutionary forces, mentioned here and personalized as Rakshasas and Asuras. That is Rajasic activity, activity that is has an achieving aspect to it. Achieving for what? For me. So every activity that says I want to achieve this goal and I'm moving toward it and I want to achieve, and there's a possibility of failure or disappointment, will obviously result in pain and is intrinsically future orientated. But Tamas says, I don't want to make any effort. There's another element. And we see it from time to time. So we may see it not as a consistent thing or a dominant thing, but we see it from time to time, and there's a change. Sometimes the mind feels lazy, indolent. At other times it's enthusiastic. But as long as this egocentric position, this narrowing position is there, it will be intrinsically painful for us and not in our favor. The contrast to that will be a non-binding, or it's still binding to say, but it has the potential of liberating or neutralizing these other elements. And this is the quality of sattva. That is purity, nobility, calmness, harmony, all of these qualities that intrinsically don't come with this egocentric position. So cultivating this is born of Sattva Guna, and Guna means a rope essentially, something that binds us, and it's not exactly a quality. Though I pointed out on the weekend when I asked this question, just to see how much I should tell people. So what are the gunas? What do they mean? And all kinds of varieties of answers were there. But you see, the common thing is it's a quality. Not exactly. Because if I say to you, please bring me a cup of white, you really have to say, please tell me, can you clarify, is it white paint, is it white milk? What kind of white thing is, there's a substance that goes along with it. So it's more an element that has a quality, not the quality itself exactly. And so we find that these evolutionary elements and forces are there, and we should cultivate from a psychological point of view this sattva guna, this element of purity, and all spiritual life, all spiritual advice, all spiritual progress is to do with this sattva, this purity, purity of action, purity of intention, purity of thought. Beings have all come from this one Paramatma. And those who know the fact and strive will go back to this Paramatma. And these are the great Mahatmas, the great souls. Self-control, love of beings, commending themselves to the supreme, that the religion calls God. These are noble traits. And these are evident in these great Mahatmas. So we'll leave off there. The next great question that this leads us to is, how do these Mahatmas, great souls, occupy themselves? And we'll pick this up next week. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace.